Lecture 16, Virgil. In our last lecture, we examined the life of Augustus, his life and achievements. Augustus was one of the greatest statesmen in history, perhaps the greatest statesman in history. And in defining a statesman and distinguishing a statesman from a politician, we need to recognize four criteria. A statesman has a bedrock of principles. A statesman has a moral compass. A statesman has a vision. And he has the ability to build a consensus to achieve that vision. Now, Augustus had a bedrock of principles, and that was power. He wanted power for himself. But he was able to identify power with himself for what was best for his country. He had a moral compass. Unlike Abraham Lincoln, he did not believe in absolute right and wrong. His moral compass was whatever worked. And that is a very practical way of approaching things. He admired Cicero for saying that no inexpedient act was ever moral, that there could be no dichotomy between morality and expediency. But he said that's just not right. In the real world, people are as they are, and they are treacherous and deceitful, and you must go along those lines. So whatever worked was moral. But he had a vision, and the vision was much like that of his father, Caesar. Rome was no longer capable of supporting republican government. A monarchy was the only solution for Rome and the only way of maintaining its empire. But, unlike Caesar, he could build a consensus to achieve that vision. Caesar got himself assassinated, did he not? That's the best way you know you have not built a consensus. Augustus survived the turmoils of Roman politics in his early days and matured to the stage where he was a true statesman, where he could do acts that were simply moral because they were moral. But to achieve that, he had to build a consensus. And part of building a consensus for a statesman is propaganda. That's a word we don't like to use. We might like to say advertising or public relations, but it is propaganda. And you must let the people know that what you are doing is good, it is for their benefit, it is working, and you are responsible for it. That is the essence of propaganda. And the propaganda of Augustus worked. It enabled him to build a consensus because it was true. There was truth behind the propaganda. We also tend to associate propaganda with bad works of literature, bad works of art, bad architecture, works, say, of the Third Reich or of Stalin. But it is the hallmark of the greatness of Augustus that the works that he commissioned in some way or other as propaganda became classics, enduring works of art and architecture and literature that would shape centuries to come. And the greatest of these all is the subject of our lecture now, the Aeneid of Virgil. The Aeneid of Virgil is the epitome of the achievement of Augustus. It would last on through the centuries. So profound was its messianic lesson that Christians would think Virgil must have been a Christian, proclaiming the coming of Christ. In as late as the time of King Charles I of England, people would open the Aeneid and point to a verse and take divine inspiration from it, base their actions on what it said. Virgil's poem was so grand that he was considered to be a magician in the Middle Ages. Only a magician could work such a wonder. But the wonder was that the conditions were created by Augustus for such a masterpiece of literature. And we want, in considering the Aeneid, to put it into the larger context of the message of Augustus, of his building a consensus. Because the central theme of Virgil in the Aeneid is that all of history has led up to the coming of Augustus. In that sense, he has been sent by the gods. He is the fulfillment of history, and in a way, he is almost the end of history, because a golden age has now been established, in which peace and prosperity will reign. This was the perception of ordinary inhabitants of this empire. Augustus was worshipped by them. Now, to us, it's very hard to grasp the concept of worshiping an emperor. To us, it must be either megalomania or blasphemy. It was not. It is simply a characteristic feature of polytheism in Greece and Rome. The polytheist is always willing to recognize new divinities. For the polytheist, the divine world is not limited. And a new god or goddess may make themselves known to you by an act of power, generally an act of beneficent power. And the definition of a divinity is a power capable of rendering supernatural benefits to the community of worshipers. You might pray forever to Apollo and not get an answer. But send a message to Augustus that your city was in famine and food arrived. And on the basis of these concrete benefits all over the empire, Augustus was worshipped as a god. And inscriptions hailed him as the savior of the human race. In the province of Asia, his birthday was taken to begin the new year. And the calendar set up to celebrate this new year stated that Providence, the gods, had sent Augustus to be the savior of the world. And never had there been such a blessing bestowed upon the world. He is also called in terms the Prince of Peace. And remember, Augustus means the one whom the gods have sent. Now, this message was broadcast by Augustus in a variety of media. The coinage. Remember, coins are for the Roman a most important means of conveying a message to the public. It is the most constant contact you have with your government. And coins of Augustus show on the obverse the portrait of Augustus, and on the reverse a Capricorn. The Capricorn is the birth sign of Augustus. And in the little hooves of the Capricorn is a globe, the world. And growing out of the back of the Capricorn is Capricorn is a cornucopia, the symbol of prosperity, the horn of plenty. And under it the simple legend, Augustus, the one whom the gods have sent. We have seen his star, do you understand that, with the Capricorn, has brought prosperity to the world. And in another coin issued in a similar period, the obverse is again the portrait of Augustus. You see, Caesar had blazed the way. He got assassinated for putting his portrait on the coin. Augustus can put it on with no problem. And on the reverse is the goddess Peace, so labeled, Pax, holding in her hand the caduceus. The snakes wound around a rod, which is the symbol of the physician today, but in antiquity was the symbol of fertility, blessings. And she is trampling on the sword of civil war. So Augustus, who is called on this coin the champion of the freedom of the Roman people, has brought peace to the world by ending civil war. So peace and prosperity, these are the constant messages. And then Augustus built. Great leaders in history build. And Augustus wanted to reshape Rome. He tells us that I founded a city of brick and left it a city of marble. And he built a huge forum. The old forum was getting too crowded, and it was too associated with the old republic. So he built his new forum, the Forum of Augustus. He surrounded it with a huge wall to make it fireproof. And the very construction of the wall itself was a statement of how constitutional his government was. because there was one little old lady there, who didn't want to sell her house. And he would not confiscate it. So he made the wall take an extra angle, and that little lady's house stayed there for centuries as a statement of how nice he was. And then inside the forum, inside the wall, was a temple to Mars Ultor. Remember? Mars the Avenger. He had sworn that he would avenge the murder of Caesar. And there, in the temple of Mars Ultor, he fulfilled his vow and also placed the standards that he had brought back from Parthia. He had assured peace on the eastern frontiers. And then on the porticos leading up to the temple, he had statues of all the famous Romans, starting back with Aeneas and Romulus. Scipio was there. The great figures like Marcellus and Quintus Fabius Maximus. And they culminate in a colossal statue of Augustus. So literally, he is the culmination of Roman history. He erected a magnificent altar to the goddess of peace in the Campus Martius, the field of Mars. And in 9 BC, it was completed. And it portrayed on the sides of the altar the Senate and the family of Augustus, moving in harmony, don't you see? There's no conflict between Senate and Augustus. They work together as partners. And then, at the far ends of the altar, this is a statue of Aeneas, a portrait of Aeneas, the founder of Rome. And at the other end, Mother Earth, with little lambs and cows at her feet, and portraits of the winds blowing gently. And she is holding on her lap little babies. So the world is growing up in peace and plenty and quiet due to the achievement of Augustus. And the altar is dedicated to peace. Remember how the Romans worshiped these divine social and political units? Remember Victoria? Remember Maine's common sense that was dedicated at the end after the Battle of Trasimene? Well, this is to peace, but a special kind of peace. Pax Augusta, the divine quality of peace that receives its fulfillment in the person and deeds of Augustus. And he left nothing to chance. We must also not control only the present, but the past. We must control how people remember us. And as one of his last acts at the age of 77, he wrote out a list of his achievements, the Res Gestae Divi Augustus, the achievements of the divine Augustus. And he started off by saying, at the age of 19, on my own authority, I raised an army, and I drove out the tyrants who were oppressing our country. Well, Brutus and Cassius didn't really think that they were tyrants, but that's how they're remembered to history. Antony is never mentioned except as a tyrant. His name never appears. And step by step, we see from Augustus's point of view how he gained power at Rome. One of the highlights of his achievements is when he restored the Republic. Remember our meeting of the Senate in 27 BC? I restored the Republic, and from that moment on, I held no more power than any other magistrate. I was just an ordinary citizen. And then, his most touching moment, he tells us, is when he received the title Pater Patriae. He describes a number of triumphs he received, the number of temples he restored. In other words, his piety towards the gods. And then concludes by saying, at the age of 77, I wrote this with my own hand. And then his instructions were that this Res Gestae, his version of history, was to be inscribed in bronze pillars that were placed in front of his mausoleum. And all over the empire, copies of this were to be placed on the temples that were erected to him. So our best preserved example comes from Turkey, from Ankara, on the temple of the divine Augustus. And there was literature. There was literature to be channeled in the direction of celebrating the achievements of Augustus and building a consensus among the Roman people. It is not a coincidence that Augustus occurs at the golden age of Roman literature. His achievements made it possible. It was the age of Horace, who in his odes celebrated Augustus as the chosen of Jupiter, sent to earth to rule as the viceroy of Jupiter, in which Livy was inspired to write his history of Rome, from the founding of the city, in which the great days of the Republic were presented as a prelude to the achievements of Augustus. And then there was Publius Virgilius Maro. Virgil was born in 70 BC. His father had been very modest in his origins, but had raised himself up, married well, made quite a bit of money, and saw to it that Virgil received an excellent education. But Virgil in his early days had spent most of his time on a farm, and he had for the rest of his life a deep love of the country and country life. Well, that again is the thing that Augustus loved. The idea of the good, solid yeoman farmer who is the backbone of Rome. He studied in Rome and all through his life had a deep interest in philosophy. Virgil did. But in 42 BC, he had a traumatic experience. His father's farm was seized as part of the confiscations. Remember the proscriptions in which Romans were put to death, and others just had their farms confiscated to be used as payment for the veterans of the armies of Caesar, of Augustus Caesar. Well, by this time, Virgil had made an important acquaintance, Maecenas. Very, very wealthy man, close friend of Augustus. And Maecenas interceded for Virgil. He got his farm back, and Virgil then, in quiet, could turn himself to writing his poetry. Virgil was deeply influenced by Greek poetry, particularly the poetry in the period after Alexander the Great. And it was a poetry that had a strong artificial quality to it, in which you sang about the beauty of living in the country when you'd probably never seen it. But it was a wonderful idyllic vision. And Virgil's first poetry, his bucolics, and then in 29 BC, his eclogues, were devoted to this kind of sophisticated poetry, singing about rural life, how to raise bees, how to use the stars to help you plow. It's poetry that still interests classical scholars, but not much of anyone else. But to Virgil's contemporaries, it was magnificent. It was perfectly structured poetry. Virgil was the most careful of craftsmen. He would dictate a few verses in the morning and then spend the whole afternoon making them absolutely perfect. And he had this obsession with the perfection of his verses. By this time, he had become a close friend with Octavian, with Augustus, and Octavian understood that Virgil was capable of something greater than this. Scholars debate this question, but I am sure that Augustus suggested to Virgil that he undertake a work truly worthy of him, a work truly worthy of Rome, a work that would show that the Latin language could carry an epic poem equal to that of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so Virgil began to compose the Aeneid. Arma virumque cano, of arms I sing, and a man. It combined in itself the story of war that was the Iliad, and the story of a great personality overcoming all difficulties that was the Odyssey. It was the story of Rome's foundation. It began right in the middle of things, right in the middle of Aeneas' journey, having fled from burning Troy. Virgil would read portions of this epic to Augustus and his family, books 2 and 4 and 6. At one point, the poetry was so powerful that a member of the imperial family fainted, carried away by the beauty of the work. The poem opens, Aeneas and his brave band are making their way across the Mediterranean, when suddenly this enormous storm comes up. And we are introduced to the hatred that the goddess Juno feels for these Trojans. Juno, who loves the city of Carthage, that city in Africa, that city which she wants one day to rule the world. And she fears that Aeneas, stricken as this little band might be, will one day found a city that will overthrow her Carthage. Why does she hate, of course, the Trojans? She has not forgotten the insult, Virgil tells us, that was given to her when Paris was asked to choose the fairest. Remember that? And he chose not Hera, Juno. He chose not Athena or Minerva. He chose Venus, Aphrodite. And it is Venus who loves the Trojans, loves them for the choice of Paris, and loves them because Aeneas is her son. But despite all her love, Juno intervenes and drives them in the storm again. And already in the first book, Venus goes to Jupiter and says, "Will there be no end of suffering for my son?" And Jupiter says, "Let me tell you something. I have not forgotten my promise that Aeneas will survive, that his descendants will found the great city. And to these Romans I give imperium sine fine, empire without end." That is the promise. And so the band is driven to Africa's shores, and by the intervention of Venus are saved and make their way to the city of Carthage. And there, Aeneas meets Dido. The Queen of Carthage, remember? We met her in one of our early lectures. She is founding this magnificent city, a widow on her own, and she is struck with love for Aeneas. And already the fame of Troy has spread to distant Carthage. And on the walls of the temple she is building are described in relief sculptures the struggle at Troy. And so at the banquet for this visitor, Dido says, "Please tell me about the fall of Troy." "It is such great pain," says Aeneas, "to relive those events. But since you ask, I will tell you." And that second book, with its description of how the Trojan horse comes in, of how death pours out of its belly, how the Trojans, believing that peace has finally come to them, are caught unaware by the treacherous Greeks, and of how Aeneas must watch his city destroyed, and realizing despite all his bravery that all is lost, watching how King Priam is struck down at the altar by the savage son Pyrrhus of Achilles, must flee with his father upon his shoulder, his little boy by his hand in his hand, holding his hand, and his wife following behind. And how, at a critical moment, he looks back, and his wife Creusa is not there. She's disappeared, not to be found. And how they made their way through treacherous seas and danger after danger until finally they are come to Carthage. And then, having told this story, having won the love of Dido, she presents him with the magnificent opportunity. Stay and be my king. Rule over this new city of Carthage. And how attractive it is to him. to stay there. He wears the purple of the Phoenicians, his hair curled, wearing perfume, supervising the building of this new city, in love with her, when suddenly the gods send their messenger, and he is told, "What are you doing? Do you not understand the great destiny that lies before you?" For he is Pius Aeneas, Aeneas the dutiful, the one who must follow the will of the gods. And so he cannot stay. As attractive as it might be, as difficult and dangerous as the path before him might be, he must follow it. And Dido, of course, goes crazy, ranting and raving and screaming at him. "How dare you betray me, you traitor? How dare you say that you're even human? Some animal must have given you birth to be so unfeeling." And he patiently explains to her that the gods have called him on this path. He sails away, and she builds her own funeral pyre, stabs herself to death, calling a curse upon the Romans and swearing that there will be nothing but war between Rome and Carthage. And Aeneas, dutiful, following the path of the gods, watches from his ship as the fire consumes her, makes his way to Italy, where he must go down into the underworld before he can found Rome. He must go down into the underworld. In other words, he must die and be reborn. And there in the underworld, his father, the shade of his father who has passed away, shows him the line of greatness that is to come. Shows him his son Iulus, who will found a city that will one day be the mother of Rome. Shows him Romulus. Shows him the twin thunderbolts, the destroyers of Africa, Scipio the elder and the younger. And then shows him Augustus Caesar, who will bound his fame with the stars. That is the culmination of what Aeneas must achieve. But the way is still not easy. He must fight wars again and again before, in the final scene of the book, our great poem, his great rival Turnus is doing hand-to-hand combat with Aeneas. And Aeneas wounds Turnus, but Turnus isn't quite dead. And Aeneas sees on him the armor of Aeneas' close friend Pallas. And he says, "You must die," and strikes him dead. And the book ends with Turnus' soul fleeting off to the underworld, whining and complaining. It ends in death. But such was the task of Aeneas. But Aeneas is but a metaphor for Augustus. Bloodshed and war were not what Augustus had wanted, but it was the only path to refound Rome. For that is what he has done, refound it, just the way Aeneas had once done through so much labor. Unlike Mark Antony, who lost his mind to the Egyptian witch Cleopatra, Augustus has stayed pure and chaste. Like Aeneas, he is Pius Augustus, who follows the path that the gods had laid out for him. And he too has gone down into the underworld and been reborn. That is the meaning of his new name. As Octavian, he had to carry out many a dreadful deed, but he has cast this off and been reborn as the one sent by the gods, the same way that Aeneas had been sent by the gods. It is a magisterial poem. It is a magisterial statement of the aims of Augustus. And such was the true achievement of Augustus that centuries later, this poem of Virgil, this magnificent work that was still not entirely finished when the poet died, Virgil left instructions that the poem be burned. It was not perfect enough. But Augustus read it and said, "It is magnificent. It must be preserved. Such was the greatness of that poem that centuries later it still speaks to us. And perhaps the greatest poet of the 20th century, T.S. Eliot, would hold it up as the paradigm of a classic. Virgil's Aeneid, the culmination of the achievement of Augustus.